2,000 years, there's been this huge puzzle, kind of hiding in plain sight right inside the Bible. And it's all about the Apostle Paul and his teachings on the law. Sometimes he sounds like its biggest fan, and other times he seems to be completely against it. So, how in the world do we untangle this ancient knot? So, that's the big question, right? Was Paul for the law or was he against it? The problem is, his own writings seem to point in both directions, and that apparent contradiction has fueled centuries, literally centuries of debate. I mean, just look at his own words. In his letter to the Romans, he says faith actually establishes the law. But then you jump over to Galatians, and he says that living by the works of the law puts you under a curse. So what gives? How can both of those things possibly be true? This is the exact puzzle he's trying to solve for the Galatians. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll dive into the contradiction itself. Then we're going to explore this really powerful idea, a tale of two different laws. And that's going to take us on a journey from an original promise to a temporary fix, and then finally to a pretty amazing resolution. All right, so this whole contradiction thing, it's really the heart and soul of Paul's letter to the Galatians. You can feel his passion. He's writing to a community that he feels has totally missed the point about faith and law, and he's really trying to get them back on track. But here's a thought. What if the problem isn't that Paul is contradicting himself? What if the problem is that we've been misunderstanding his terms all along? This whole interpretation hinges on one fascinating idea, that Paul was actually talking about two completely different concepts, even though we often just translate them with a single word, law. And this brings us right to the core of the solution, a tale of two laws. The idea here is that if you can grasp this one distinction, it's like finding the key that unlocks Paul's letters, especially Galatians. What's so cool is that Paul actually gives us the vocabulary himself. In the original Greek, he uses these specific phrases: nomos pistis, which means the law of faith, and nomos ergon, the law of works. Now, these aren't just fancy words. He's using them as precise, technical terms for two totally different systems. And when you put them side by side, the differences are, well, they're huge. You have the book of the covenant, that's the law of faith. It came straight from God, accepted by faith, almost like a marriage proposal. But then you have the book of the law of works. That came later. It was imposed through mediators after the first promise was broken. And it acted more like a temporary strict tutor that came with curses for disobedience. Okay, so to really see how this plays out, we have to go back to the beginning of the story. Because the biblical story doesn't actually start with a bunch of rules. It starts with a promise, a covenant that was based purely on faith. So check out how this timeline unfolds. It all kicks off with God's promise to Abraham. That promise gets formalized later at Mount Sinai in what's called the Book of the Covenant, which the people accept by faith. But then disaster strikes. The golden calf incident, that original faith covenant, gets shattered. And in response to that failure, a different law, the Book of the Law, is imposed as a consequence. So here's the crucial point. The good news, the original promise, was already there, long before the system of rules that Paul seems to criticize. The promise to Abraham, the one based on faith, is the real foundation. Everything that comes after has to be seen through the lens of that original faith-based agreement. And that brings us to the second system, the Book of the Law. According to this view, this law was never the original plan. Nope, it was a necessary addition, a temporary measure put in place because that original promise was broken. Paul himself tells us its purpose. He basically asks the question for us. So why the law then? And his answer is crystal clear. It was added because of transgressions. You can think of it like a temporary patch, something designed to manage the situation until the original promise could finally be fulfilled. And this is a really, really key distinction. Unlike the Book of the Covenant, which was accepted freely by faith, this Book of the Law was imposed. Paul even calls it a tutor or a guard, basically a disciplinary system designed to keep everyone in line until what he calls the time of Reformation. Okay, now here is where it gets really fascinating. Over in Colossians, Paul says the Messiah wiped out a handwriting that was against us, and he did it by nailing it to the cross. For centuries, people have asked, what exactly was this handwriting? Well, the proposed answer is found way back in the Old Testament. When Moses delivers the Book of the Law, he says, word for word, that it will stand as a witness against you. This is the aha moment. It seems Paul's handwriting against us is the very same Book of the Law that was designed from the start to be a witness against you. So, how does this all wrap up? Well, if you have two laws, one being a promise and the other a temporary tutor, then the arrival of the Messiah is the moment that finally resolves all that tension between them. And here's the absolute heart of it. Redemption isn't from law in general. No, it's very specific. It's redemption from the curse of that temporary disciplinary book of the law. The Messiah's death basically pays off the penalty, which clears the path for everyone to return to the original covenant of faith. And once again, Paul just says it directly. He says, the Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the law for a reason, so that the blessing of Abraham, that original promise, could finally reach everyone, all the nations. It's not about getting rid of law, it's about fulfilling the original faith-based promise. So let's just pull all these threads together. The real prize, the inheritance, was always in the book of the covenant. The book of the law, that temporary measure that came 430 years later, could never cancel out that first promise. The law of works was never about faith, so in the end, the story is about being set free from that temporary system to be restored to the original law of faith. The entire story arc, then, is a journey. It goes from an original promise to a big problem to a powerful redemption and finally a full restoration. The whole thing comes full circle, ending right back where it all started, with a covenant based entirely on faith. And this leaves us with one final big question to think about. If this whole framework is right, if Paul was carefully and meticulously distinguishing between two different systems this whole time, what does that mean for us today? How does that perspective completely reshape our modern conversations about faith, our actions, and what it truly means to be obedient?
If this message touched your spirit today, that's not by accident. You were meant to hear this, to be reminded that faith and purpose walk hand in hand. Together, we're building a community that empowers believers to walk boldly in truth and grace. So don't just watch, like, subscribe, and share this message with someone who needs it today.